The jungle in Vietnam was never silent. Even when no gunfire echoed through the trees, it still felt alive with sound. Insects filled the air with constant vibration. Leaves shifted without visible wind. Water dripped from unseen branches like the jungle was breathing slowly, deliberately, watching everything that moved beneath its canopy. For American soldiers entering this environment, it was not just a deployment. It was a disorientation of reality. Everything they had been trained to trust began to fail in small, quiet ways. Distance no longer meant safety. Silence no longer meant absence. And visibility was reduced to fragments of green, shadow, and uncertainty. This was a war where perception mattered more than planning. And perception was constantly under attack. In this environment, every weapon carried into the jungle became more than just equipment. It became a psychological anchor, something to hold on to when everything else dissolved into chaos. Among those weapons, the M14 rifle stood as one of the most paradoxical tools ever issued to American forces in Vietnam. On paper, it represented strength. It fired the powerful 7.62 by 51 mm NATO cartridge, a round designed for range, penetration, and battlefield dominance. It could strike targets at distances far beyond what most jungle engagements required. It could punch through dense vegetation, wooden structures, and cover that would stop lighter weapons. It was accurate. It was powerful. It was reliable in controlled conditions. But Vietnam was not controlled. The rifle had been designed with assumptions that no longer applied. Assumptions about distance, visibility, and structured engagement. Assumptions that belonged to a different type of war. In Vietnam, those assumptions collapsed almost immediately. Most patrols moved slowly through dense jungle trails where visibility rarely extended beyond a few meters. The terrain itself resisted movement. Roots twisted underfoot. Mud pulled at boots. Heat pressed down like a physical weight. The air was thick enough to feel like resistance. Every sound carried meaning, but meaning was never clear. A branch snapping could be wind, or it could be the beginning of contact. When contact happened, it did not follow a sequence. There was no warning phase. No build-up. No transition. It was instant. One moment, silence. The next moment, explosion. Automatic fire erupted from concealed positions hidden within vegetation that had already been studied and prepared by the enemy. The jungle itself seemed to transform in that instant, shifting from environment to weapon. And in that transition, human reaction time became the deciding factor. Not planning. Not doctrine. Reaction. The M14 rifle responded mechanically as designed. Each trigger pull released a 7.62 mm round with significant force. The recoil pushed back into the shoulder. The bolts cycled. The weapon remained stable in function. But function was not the problem. The problem was direction. Because in the first seconds of ambush, direction does not exist clearly. Targets are not visible in full form. They are fragments. Movement behind leaves. Sound without shape. Muzzle flashes in the distance that vanish almost instantly. Under those conditions, soldiers did not always aim at targets. They aimed at space, at probability, at threat direction rather than confirmed presence. The jungle absorbed everything. Bullets struck vegetation, tree trunks, soil, and unseen positions. Each shot created noise that blended with incoming fire, producing a layered soundscape where orientation became nearly impossible. Communication broke down quickly. Commands were lost in gunfire. Even teammates became difficult to distinguish in the chaos. The M14 continued to function exactly as intended. But combat in Vietnam was not defined by mechanical reliability. It was defined by whether a weapon could be used effectively within the first 2 seconds of contact. And those 2 seconds were everything. In those seconds, discipline collapsed into instinct. And instinct does not aim with precision. It reacts. The psychological effect of the rifle under these conditions was complex. Soldiers often described it as both reassuring and overwhelming at the same time. The rifle felt powerful in the hands, but the environment made its power difficult to fully direct. Each shot carried weight, not just physical recoil, but mental consequence. Because every trigger pull revealed position. Every muzzle flash exposed location. Every sound carried through vegetation like a signal to unseen observers. Yet not firing was not an option either. Because silence in Vietnam was not safety. It was vulnerability. The battlefield did not reward hesitation. It punished it immediately. As operations continued deeper into the jungle, soldiers began to adapt in ways that doctrine had not fully anticipated. Fire discipline shifted under stress. Engagement ranges shortened mentally even if the rifle was capable of much more. The M14's strength was range and power. But most engagements never reached that range. They collapsed into close proximity, sometimes less than 10 meters. At those distances, the difference between survival and casualty was measured not in accuracy, but in reaction speed. And reaction speed under fire is fragile. The human mind under sudden threat does not operate linearly. It compresses time. It filters input. It prioritizes survival over analysis. This leads to decisions that are fast, but not always precise. The M14 required precision to fully utilize its design advantages. Vietnam rarely allowed precision. There were documented patterns across engagements where initial contact resulted in immediate suppression fire from both sides. Vegetation would light up with muzzle flashes. Sound would become overwhelming. Orientation would degrade rapidly. And within that chaos, whoever achieved dominance in the first seconds often controlled the entire engagement. The M14 could contribute to that dominance. But it was not optimized for speed of transition from perception to action. It belonged to a doctrine where engagement was expected to be slightly more structured, slightly more predictable, slightly more stable. Vietnam removed stability entirely. Night operations made this even more extreme. Darkness eliminated visual confirmation almost completely. Targets could only be inferred through movement, sound, or return fire. Muzzle flash became the only temporary reference point in an otherwise invisible environment. Each shot carried tactical exposure. Each burst revealed position in an environment where concealment was already fragile. Yet refraining from firing carried equal risk, because unseen enemies were often already positioned within close range. There was no correct choice that guaranteed safety, only choices that shifted probability. As the war progressed, the limitations of heavier rifles like the M14 became increasingly visible in infantry doctrine. The emphasis gradually shifted toward lighter weapons with higher capacity magazines and faster engagement cycles. The goal was no longer just power. It was adaptability. But transitions in warfare are not immediate. They overlap across years, units, and operational environments. During that overlap, the M14 remained in service in roles where its strengths still applied. Designated marksman roles, defensive positions, situations where distance could still be established. In those conditions, the rifle returned to what it was originally designed to be: a precise, powerful weapon capable of dominating longer engagement ranges. But those conditions represented a smaller portion of the overall war. Most combat in Vietnam was not structured. It was fragmented, unpredictable, and compressed into short, violent exchanges where the first moments determined everything that followed. Veterans who carried the M14 often described it as a weapon of dual identity. In controlled environments, it was exceptional. In uncontrolled environments, it required adaptation from the user to compensate for its design assumptions. It did not fail mechanically. It failed situationally when environment did not match expectation. That distinction matters, because Vietnam was not a test of weapons alone. It was a test of adaptability under pressure where conditions constantly shifted faster than equipment could evolve. In defensive engagements, the M14 could still dominate lanes of fire. Its rounds could penetrate cover and suppress movement effectively. In those moments, its power became undeniable again. But most of Vietnam did not allow structured engagement. It forced improvisation from the very first second of contact. And improvisation is not part of weapon design. It is part of human survival response. The legacy of the M14 rifle is therefore not defined by success or failure in simple terms. It is defined by its position in a transitional phase of warfare history. A phase where traditional expectations of controlled combat were colliding with the reality of close-range, high-speed, unpredictable jungle warfare. It represents a moment where doctrine lagged behind reality, and soldiers were forced to bridge that gap themselves in real time. In that gap, every decision became compressed into seconds. And in those seconds, the M14 proved both its strength and its limitation. It was powerful enough to end fights decisively, but not always fast enough to control them. And in Vietnam, control was never assumed. It had to be achieved instantly, or it was already gone. The jungle did not care about weapons. It did not care about calibers, doctrine, or the countries that sent men into it. It only cared about one thing: what happened in the first moments when silence broke. And in Vietnam, silence never lasted long. By the time American units adapted to the environment, the M14 rifle had already become something more complicated than just a standard-issue firearm. It was a reminder of an earlier idea of war, a belief that distance could be controlled, that firepower could be disciplined, that battles could still be shaped like clean diagrams on a training board. Vietnam destroyed that belief. Not suddenly, but repeatedly. Patrol after patrol. Ambush after ambush. The jungle taught the same lesson in different ways until it could not be ignored anymore. When contact happened, it was never symmetrical. One side was always already waiting. The other side was always already reacting too late. And in that gap between action and awareness, the M14 existed as both advantage and burden. Its strength was undeniable. The 7.62 by 51 mm round carried enough energy to change the shape of anything it struck. Trees split. Cover failed. Distance meant less when the bullet arrived. In open terrain, the rifle could dominate space with brutal efficiency. But Vietnam was not open terrain. It was layered, vertical, confusing. A battlefield where sight lines ended in green walls and movement existed in fragments rather than forms. In those conditions, the M14 could not always express its advantage. Because advantage requires identification, and identification requires time. Time was the first thing Vietnam removed. Soldiers often described the first seconds of contact as something that felt unreal. A shift from stillness into overload. Sound replacing thought. Movement replacing structure. The body reacting before the mind could fully interpret what was happening. In those seconds, firing was not a decision. It was an instinct. An instinct does not calculate recoil patterns or optimal engagement angles. It only reacts to threat. The M14 responded mechanically without hesitation. Each shot was consistent. Each cycle was reliable. The rifle did exactly what it was engineered to do. But engineering assumes control. Combat removes it. In the chaos of jungle engagements, muzzle flashes from multiple directions created a strobing effect through vegetation. Light appeared and disappeared instantly. Shadows shifted in ways that confused depth perception. The human eye, already under stress, struggled to maintain orientation. Targets were rarely seen fully. They were perceived. A shape behind leaves. A sudden shift in movement. A sound without visible source. And in those moments, soldiers fired at uncertainty. The rifle turned that uncertainty into force. But force without direction spreads. Rounds tore through foliage, sometimes hitting nothing, sometimes hitting something that was never clearly identified in the moment. The jungle absorbed the difference between accuracy and guesswork, and it did not respond. It only continued. Communication between soldiers often broke down within seconds of contact. Radios were unreliable in close-range firefights. Voice commands were drowned out by gunfire. Hand signals became invisible in dense vegetation. Each man became isolated inside the same battle. This isolation changed how weapons were experienced. The M14 was no longer a coordinated tool. It became a personal anchor, something held tightly in moments where everything else dissolved into noise. But anchors do not guide movement. They only provide weight. And weight in combat can either stabilize or slow reaction depending on conditions. As engagements repeated across different regions, riverbanks, hill trails, jungle clearings, patterns began to emerge that contradicted initial expectations of rifle performance. The weapon itself did not change, but the environment constantly invalidated assumptions about how it would be used. At longer distances, it remained dominant. At close distances, it became a test of human reaction speed rather than mechanical superiority. In Vietnam, more often than not, forced close distances. This is where the psychological burden of the rifle became visible in after-action accounts. Soldiers did not describe the M14 as ineffective. They described it as demanding. It required a level of control that was difficult to maintain under sudden threat. Every trigger pull carried consequence. Not just tactical consequence, but perceptual consequence. Because firing revealed position. And position in Vietnam was fragile. There was no guarantee that firing would improve survival odds. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it escalated exposure. Sometimes it simply added noise to already overwhelming chaos. The uncertainty itself became part of the experience. As the war progressed further, changes in infantry doctrine began to reflect accumulated battlefield reality. Lighter weapons with higher magazine capacities started to replace older systems in frontline roles. The emphasis shifted from controlled precision to sustained adaptability under pressure. But transitions did not erase existing weapons immediately. They coexisted. Different units used different systems based on mission type, terrain, and availability. And in that overlap period, the M14 remained active in roles where its strengths still had meaning. Designated marksman, defensive positions, situations where distance could be reintroduced into engagement dynamics. In those environments, the rifle returned to its intended identity, controlled, precise, powerful. But those environments were not the majority of the war. The majority was movement, uncertainty, and compression of decision-making into fractions of seconds. Veterans who carried the M14 often remembered it not with simple judgment, but with layered understanding. It was not a weapon that failed them. It was a weapon that exposed the difference between controlled theory and uncontrolled reality. In structured conditions, it excelled. In chaotic conditions, it required adaptation. And that adaptation was not always mechanical. It was human. Because survival in Vietnam was rarely about the weapon alone. It was about how quickly the mind could transition from stillness to action under sudden threat. And that transition is never fully stable. Even today, the M14 stands as a representation of that transitional era in warfare, a period where the assumptions of distance, structure, and controlled engagement were being dismantled in real time by a jungle that refused to behave according to expectation. It was not the end of one weapon system. It was the beginning of a new understanding of combat itself, where speed mattered as much as power, where reaction mattered as much as accuracy, and where the first seconds of contact decided outcomes more than everything that came after. The M14 could end fights. But Vietnam demanded something more immediate. It demanded control at the exact moment control was hardest to achieve. And that is where the real horror existed, not in the weapon itself, but in the gap between what it was designed for and what the jungle required it to be. The jungle never reset itself. It remembered everything. Every shot fired into its walls of green. Every explosion that shook its silence. Every movement that ended too quickly for anyone to fully understand what had happened. And for the men who carried the M14 deeper into Vietnam's interior, that memory felt like pressure building over time. Not emotional pressure alone, but tactical pressure. The kind that comes from knowing that every step forward increases the chance of sudden collapse into violence. By this stage of the war, soldiers were no longer thinking in terms of doctrine. Doctrine had already failed them too many times. They were thinking in terms of seconds. Distance to contact. Reaction time. First shot advantage. The M14 rifle remained in their hands, but its identity in combat had shifted. It was no longer viewed through manuals or training descriptions. It was judged by something far more immediate. What happens in the first 2 seconds when everything goes wrong? In structured environments, the rifle still behaved exactly as designed. Controlled firing. Stable recoil. Deep penetration through vegetation. At range, it still had authority. It could suppress positions that lighter weapons struggled to reach. But Vietnam rarely gave range. Most engagements collapsed into something much smaller. A sudden sound in the brush. A flash of movement between trees. A split-second decision before the body had time to fully understand what the eyes had seen. In those moments, the M14 became something different in the hands of the soldier holding it. Not a precision instrument, but a survival instrument. Each trigger pull carried weight beyond physics. The 7.62 round itself was not just a projectile. It was a psychological statement. When it struck, it did not whisper impact. It announced it. But announcing impact was only useful if there was something visible to impact. And Vietnam rarely offered clarity. Firefights in dense jungle were not symmetrical exchanges. They were collisions. One side already positioned. The other side already exposed. And between those two states, no negotiation existed. Only reaction. Soldiers often describe the sensation of contact as a narrowing of reality. The world shrank. Sound became dominant. Vision became fragmented. Time no longer felt linear. The first burst of fire from either side usually determined everything that followed. Not because it ended the fight immediately, but because it decided psychological dominance. Who is moving? Who is reacting? Who is surviving? The M14 could contribute to that dominance, but it demanded precision in a moment where precision was least available. Under stress, human perception becomes unstable. Targets are not fully formed. They are inferred from motion, shape, and instinct. And instinct is fast, but not always accurate. The rifle itself did not compensate for that gap. It required the shooter to bridge it manually. That is where its difficulty existed in Vietnam, not in its mechanical performance, but in its dependency on human clarity during moments where clarity collapsed first. As engagements repeated across different terrains, river crossings, jungle ridges, abandoned villages, soldiers began to notice a pattern that no training had fully prepared them for. The closer the engagement, the less the weapon mattered as a system, and the more the human reaction mattered as a variable. At extreme close range, the difference between survival and casualty was measured not in firepower alone, but in milliseconds of delay between perception and action. The M14 could end a fight decisively when used properly, but properly assumed conditions Vietnam rarely provided. Even in defensive positions, where structure returned briefly to combat, unpredictability remained. Night attacks, sudden probing fire, infiltration attempts, all of them forced immediate response without confirmation. And in darkness, confirmation itself became unreliable. Muzzle flashes became the only visual reference. Sound became direction. Everything else dissolved into uncertainty. Each shot fired from the M14 revealed position. Each burst created exposure. But not firing left uncertainty unresolved. There was no safe option, only competing risks. That contradiction defined much of the rifle's legacy in the war. As the conflict progressed, newer weapon systems began to replace older ones in frontline roles. The shift was not immediate, but gradual. Lighter rifles with higher magazine capacity and faster handling began to dominate infantry doctrine. The emphasis changed. From controlled precision to sustained adaptability. From measured fire to immediate response. But during that transition, the M14 did not disappear. It remained in specialized roles where its strengths still mattered. Long-range observation, defensive fire support, situations where terrain briefly allowed distance to matter again. In those conditions, it returned to form. Precise, powerful, reliable. But those conditions were not the majority. The majority was chaos compressed into close-range encounters where reaction time mattered more than ballistic superiority. Veterans who carried the M14 often did not describe it as either good or bad. They described it as conditional. A weapon that worked exceptionally well when the environment allowed it to function as designed, and struggled when the environment forced it into scenarios it was not optimized for. It was not failure. It was mismatch. And Vietnam was full of mismatches between expectation and reality, between design and environment, between theory and survival. In that gap, the rifle became something more complex than its specifications. It became a symbol of a transitional phase in warfare history, where traditional ideas of engagement were being replaced in real time by new realities of speed, unpredictability, and psychological pressure. The jungle did not care about that transition. It only responded to action, and action in Vietnam was always measured in seconds. Not minutes. Not planning cycles. Seconds. And in those seconds, the M14 rifle existed at the edge of two worlds, one built on structure and one built on collapse. It could dominate one, but it struggled to fully control the other. And that is where its true story in Vietnam sits. Not as a perfect weapon, not as a failed weapon, but as a weapon caught in the exact moment warfare itself was changing.